Welcome, everyone, to the Unpoly podcast. I'm Steve Paikin.
And I'm John Michael McGrath.
Today on the pod, a controversial declaration from the official opposition leader who says when she's premier, the current premier's going to jail.
The legislature just voted down a bill to keep AI misinformation out of Ontario's elections. We're going to talk about that and some other election talk.
The government says it will give special constables the power to arrest drug users on the buses, streetcars, and subways of Ontario's capital city.
And speaking of Toronto, in your column, my column, I will ask whether it's time for Ontario to drop its prohibition on municipal political parties.
And I'm following up on the Billy Bishop Airport story. The province wants it expanded, the city doesn't, and the feds, well, at the moment, crickets.
It's Friday, May 8th, 2026, so let's get to it.
JMM, a little Unpolysugar to get us started, as we do every week?
Yes.
As we do every week. Okay. Oh, you look at you. Okay. I gave you that T-shirt last week on behalf of the good folks in Richmond Hill.
Yes.
And you're wearing it already.
Yes. The David Dunlop Observatory is on the T-shirt here. This was a gift from the Thornhill Library, though.
It was indeed.
Yes.
Richmond Hill.
Richmond Hill. I'm sorry. Richmond Hill Library.
A different hill.
Yes.
Richmond as opposed to Thorn.
Yes. And so I was trying to figure if I could come up with some significant dates of in astronomy around May 8th, and
what'd you come up with?
I didn't find a lot in terms of specifically for May 8th, except that one of the earliest photographs of Halley's Comet was taken on May 8th, 1910. Happy, I guess not even a proper anniversary to that picture of Halley's Comet.
Well, can I say how fetching the shirt looks on you?
Also, my wife was quite happy with this gift.
Because she didn't have to buy it.
Well, she didn't have to buy it, and it's appropriately nerdy for me. So,
very good. All right, who am I wearing this week? I'm going to stand up here for a second so everyone can see Colonel George Drew. And yes, they did call him the Colonel. This was back in the days when all of our premiers of Ontario, once upon a time, were war veterans. And so they often went by their titles. May 7th, 1894. May 7, 1894, 132 years ago, George Drew was born. And he's an important premier for a bunch of reasons. Number one, he's the first premier in that 42-year-long Conservative dynasty from 1943 to 1985. He won the first election. Despite that, despite being the first premier as part of that dynasty, he actually lost his own seat, which is hard to do. 5 years later in the 48 election, he lost his own seat. The issue was booze. He wanted to liberalize the hours of operation for taverns, and as a result, he represented a West End Toronto riding, High Park, and as a result, a temperance champion named William Temple, or Temperance Willie, as they called him back then, running for the CCF. This is the party before the NDP, the Cooperative Commonwealth Federation. He challenged George Drew, and he beat the premier in his own riding. Now, you know how this usually works, right? If a premier loses his or her seat, they usually get a backbencher to step down, they create a by-election, and he or she will run there.
Yes.
Didn't happen this time. Instead, he quit provincial politics altogether. He went and became the leader of the National Progressive Conservative Party. He became the federal Tory leader. And do you know, he was very successful, won on the first ballot. Do you know who he beat in the 48 PC Leadership Convention? There's no reason you would know, but you've heard of him, trust me.
Okay.
You've heard of him.
I'm at a loss.
He would become a future Prime Minister of Canada. Does that help?
A future
Tory Prime Minister of Canada.
So it would be Diefenbaker?
Yes,
okay.
That's right. He beat John George Diefenbaker at that convention. Dief won the next convention. Right. Anyways, George Drew did not have as much luck federally as he did provincially. He lost 2 federal elections and then retired from public life, had bad health, and died in 1973. Sheldon, can we see the shot of his final resting place? There it is. Looks actually quite monumental. And that's in Guelph. He is buried in the city of Guelph, and that's the George Drew story, which began 132 years ago yesterday.
Please correct me if I'm wrong, because I think you would have a better grasp of this than I do. But my memory of George Drew, we don't have specifically a housing policy topic on today's agenda, so I'm going to shoehorn one in here.
Of course.
George Drew, pretty staunch anti-communist, very, very, conservative, even by the standards of conservatives, right? Mm-hmm. And staunch anti-communist at a time when that was a very live issue, and yet the rise of the CCF and that strong showing and beating him in his own riding was, as I understand it, one of the early signals that the provincial Progressive Conservative Party could moderate some of its very hard anti-communist and anti-socialist policies, and they decided that maybe they didn't have to be foursquare against things like public housing, and that throwing the unions a bone every once in a while was something that added to their political longevity. Let me put it that way.
Now, we have not set this up, but I'm going to ask him another trivia question here. Who do you think came up with the expression? Well, you probably know. Who came up with the expression, the big blue machine, talking about the Progressive Conservative Party of Ontario?
Oh, I should know. Again, my understanding was that actually came out of Bill Davis's win, where he welded the two parts of the party together.
That's what everybody thinks.
Okay.
Bill Davis came up with that, right? The big blue machine.
No. George Drew.
George Drew was the first guy to use the expression, we are building a big blue machine all the way from Windsor north and across Ontario through the east. So he didn't necessarily get to celebrate all of the fruits of the labors of the big blue machine because, as I say, he did lose his seat and was out after just 5 years. But he's the first guy to use that expression.
Well, and the machine he started cobbling together did in fact govern for 40 unbroken years.
42, actually.
42. So.
Now, do we want to say that the current premier is sitting atop a big blue machine? Because after all, not only has he won 3 straight elections, but we have to call him Dr. Ford now, don't we?
Yes. Elegant segue there, sir. Yes. So Premier Ford was granted an honorary doctorate from, it was Saginaw Valley State University, which is a public university in the state of Michigan.
Yeah.
And he was given a doctorate in, I think, humane letters or?
Yeah.
Yeah. I have no honorary doctorates. I just have my dishonorable ones. No, I have no doctorate. I have 2 degrees. But yeah, congratulations to the premier, I suppose.
Well, for those who say that he doesn't deserve it because he actually didn't go to class and get his degree that way, there are 2 ways you can get a degree from a post-secondary institution.
Yes.
One is to go to class, like you and I did.
Yes.
And get the credits, and then at the end of the day, go to convocation and you have a degree. And the other is to do things outside the class, which a university or college deems in the significant public interest, and they will give you an honorary degree for that. So that's what Doug Ford got, because we say, and I'm not saying this with any malice or nuisance or anything like that, but Doug Ford discovered at a very young age that post-secondary was not for him.
And it's not for everybody.
No, he went to Humber for, I think, a matter of weeks or months, and then dropped out and went into business, and it just wasn't for him. So, but he's now
clearly made something of himself.
He's made something of himself, and all these years later, he finally has a post-secondary degree. So good for Dr. Ford.
Yeah, there's been some speculation about why would this American university grant an Ontario premier an honorary doctorate? And I don't think I've seen any reporting in terms of actually explaining the university's thinking. But I will say, and this is admittedly speculation on my part, but there are a lot of American organizations and institutions right now that are trying their very best to rebuild bridges and repair frayed relationships between the U.S. and Canada. And so I would not be at all surprised if somebody at Saginaw Valley State University had thought, hey, you know what? Maybe this is something we can do just to remind Canadians that we're not all enamored with the current government.
Oh, look how nice. I was going to say Trump-loving heathens, and you said not enamored with the current government. You're always so much more diplomatic than me. And with that, let's get off to issue 1. Premier Doug Ford is no stranger to heated rhetoric. He did, after all, recently have to apologize to Liberal MPP Stephanie Smythe for remarks he made about her career before politics. But this week, Ford was on the receiving end of some nasty rhetoric, with NDP leader Marit Stiles saying that if her party forms government after the next election, she'll call a public inquiry to investigate the Progressive Conservatives, and that Ford could even find himself, quote, in jail before then. Ford called the accusation Trump-style rhetoric, and his government House Leader Steve Clark said that language has no place in Ontario or Canada. Okay, JMM, the background, please.
Right. So Stiles' remarks came in the context of the PC majority in the legislature voting to pass the government's changes to Ontario's Freedom of Information law. That was included, of course, in the budget measures bill. So no surprise that this was passed by the legislature. But we are starting to see the specific impacts of those changes, and it includes the fact that some documents that were supposed to be released relating to the Greenbelt scandal from 2022 and 2023, those releases have now been canceled, and documents that the public would have previously been entitled to will now be kept secret, at least for some time, and we'll get to that in a second. Stiles was saying, in effect, that should the NDP form government, her future government would find a way to bring those documents to light with like a public inquiry as a for example. And she was reminding voters that Ford is, last we heard, currently the subject of an RCMP criminal investigation. All of that is basically like a statement of fact. It doesn't quite fit into the soundbite, right? The soundbite Stiles provided, to many ears, sounded a lot closer to that Trump-style lock him up rhetoric.
Well, lock her up in the case of Trump.
Yes.
He was talking about Hillary.
And that's the nature of the criticism that Stiles faced this week.
Any indication that the opposition leader is prepared to apologize for this?
No apology forthcoming, and no quarter asked, no quarter given. The premier is not asking for an apology either.
Okay, should we do a full disclosure here?
Sure.
You and I kind of like civility in politics.
We do.
That is our preferred default position. We are not fans of the politics of personal destruction. We are not fans of overheated rhetoric.
Yes.
So what do you make of all this?
So on top of that, you and I are also parents. And I'm tempted to reach for the admonition I might use with my 10-year-old, two wrongs don't make a right. I think it is, in fact, fair and factual to say that Stiles wasn't actually saying like that she would direct Ontario's Crown prosecutors to, charge and prosecute Doug Ford. That's not what she was saying, and I don't think that's a fair reading of what she did say. However, the in-house position here at the Unpoly podcast is, it's not just that we want people to be civil in the narrow sense, but that, it's better for our politics if people take a bit more care with the things they say and stay far away from those zones where the rhetoric could be construed in, the way we're speaking of that the implication that she might prosecute her political enemies.
Yeah, we don't want any of that kind of stuff. So that's one cliche. You got any others up your sleeve?
I do, in fact. Maybe a cliche or simply a Bible verse. Not often that I quote scripture here on this podcast, but Matthew 26:52, he who lives by the sword dies by the sword.
Ah, yes, indeed.
Doug Ford has not just used overheated rhetoric of his own against his political opponents. He has specifically used this kind of rhetoric, right? In 2018, after winning the election, so he was speaking not as opposition leader Doug Ford, he was speaking as Premier Doug Ford. Mm-hmm. For folks who don't remember the context here, the young PC government was just trying to stick the knife into the ailing Liberal Party of the day, and they were looking to punish them for the Fair Hydro Plan. There were lots of genuine reasons to criticize the Fair Hydro Plan, including from the Auditor General of the day. The PC allegations were that there were financial and accounting tricks that the government used to hide the costs. Specifically, Ford said of that plan, quote, if you tried to play these dirty accounting tricks in business, if you tried to pull that kind of cover up in the private sector, the Ontario Securities Commission would come calling, the police would come calling.
Oof.
So
I don't love that either.
Exactly, right? The Progressive Conservatives then convened a select committee of the legislature to investigate the Fair Hydro Plan. They made tons of government documents public and called both politicians and civil servants to testify about it. I will remind, something we've mentioned on the podcast before, but when you get called to testify before a legislative or parliamentary committee, you do not have the right to remain silent. The constitutional bargain is that anything you say before a parliamentary committee cannot be used against you in criminal prosecution, but you very literally lose a constitutional right when you are forced to testify before a parliamentary committee. So this is like serious business. So if we strip away the heated allegations of the moment, what Stiles was proposing, or what we can read her statement as meaning, it really directly mirrors what the Progressive Conservatives actually did in power to their own political opponents as one of their first orders of business. People warned the Premier and the Progressive Conservative Party that they might not love the precedent that they were setting, that they might come to regret it. They went ahead and did it anyway. So, those warnings were ignored.
There's a bit of a reap what you sow going on here. A little bit. Okay, so whether it's 8 years ago with Doug Ford, or a couple of weeks ago against Stephanie Smythe with Doug Ford,
yes,
or last week with Marit Stiles against Doug Ford, maybe everybody could just take a bit of a chill pill. We're not having an election in this province, probably not for another 3 years. Yeah. We get that the rhetoric heats up around election time, but we're not anywhere near an election, so maybe everybody, all sides, could just take a little more care with what they are saying. And to that end, would you mind if I shared a new initiative with you?
You've got something to plug.
I'm a little bit involved with something here. There's a new group called Decency Matters, and it has been launched by the former Deputy Premier of Ontario, Christine Elliott. Full disclosure, I'm a volunteer involved with this thing. I like their mission to make decency the kind of default condition in business, in politics, in every endeavor. Let's just be increasingly decent to one another. I don't think we want to go the way that things have gone in the United States. I think we like the notion of Canada being a kinder, gentler place. So let's ask that way, and let's try and model that behavior. And I say to anybody watching or listening to this, if this appeals to you, get involved. Go to decencymatters.ca and let's get more decent.
You mentioned the state of politics in the United States. We've already alluded to some of it before. One of the things that I've been reading a lot about lately is the early founding of the American Republic. Obviously they spent a lot of thought on the shape of institutions, what kind of powers the government should have, the nature of this thing that they were trying to bring into the world. But one of the other issues that really seized that founding generation was this basic question of, what did it mean to be an individual living in a democracy? And questions of individual virtue. Could the crooked timber of humanity be made into the kind of people who could live virtuous lives in freedom? And those are fascinating debates going through the 17 and 1800s of what, not just what is the state's obligation to its citizens and what do citizens have to do in this state, but just how do we all live with each other in a free, multicultural, in that sense of not having Catholics and Protestants try to kill each other.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah. Been there, done that.
And so I would just, not to ramble about this point, but I would say, it is a debate worth having again in the 21st century still, not just, what do we expect from the government? What should the government expect from its citizens? But what kinds of behaviors should we be modeling for each other?
Amen. Well said. decencymatters.ca. That's the website if you want more. And with that, let's get off to issue 2. Think about this for a second. During the next election, whenever it happens, do you think it will be a good thing to keep AI fabrications and other misinformation out of the campaign? Interim Liberal leader John Fraser did, and he pitched a private member's bill to that effect. Interestingly, the majority of MPPs voted the bill down. Why?
Well, the short version is because it was a private member's bill, and the majority almost always votes down the opposition's private member's bill. But let's get into the details, shall we? We are talking here about Bill 99. As you say, this is John Fraser's Free and Fair Elections Act. The bill would do a few different things, but the newsiest bit, the bit we are talking about, is that it would have forced anyone engaging in election advertising, either political parties or third-party advertisers, to clearly identify when they've used AI to generate content for an ad. So it would not, strictly speaking, have prohibited the use of AI in advertising, but anybody who did so would be forced to very clearly identify that they had used AI to produce imagery or audio or whatever. We are going to talk about some of the other parts of the bill, but as I say, this is a private member's bill. You and I have seen this over and over and over again. In fact, private members' bills are so frequently defeated by the governing majority of the day that at this point, I think most opposition members have kind of given up on trying to.
Well, except that they're useful in establishing what an issue might be and
Yes.
and creating some debate around it, as we're doing right now.
Yes.
And getting people to kind of plant their flag where they are. And apparently the Tories are against this.
Yes, and so let me sort of summarize the debate. So this bill went to second reading debate. It did not get any kind of committee hearing or anything. It was defeated after the second reading debate. And so the argument for the bill from John Fraser is, simply that AI is moving so quickly that the technology needs some guardrails to be put up early, that we have frankly already seen some cases from other jurisdictions where AI fabricated so-called deepfakes have been used to accuse public figures of saying or doing things that they did not in fact say or do. Fraser's bill sought to, as we said, to put some guardrails on. But there was more to it than that.
Yeah, I think the AI was only part of it, right? It had other aspects as well?
Yes, absolutely. So, most of these recommendations were lifted with credit, if I could put it that way, from the recommendations of the chief electoral officer, who is required to produce a report after every election. We had an election in 2025. The chief electoral officer has issued a report that includes 17 recommendations for legislative changes. Most of these recommendations, many of the recommendations, if I could put it this way, are designed to clean up some of the problems that are caused by Ontario having abandoned fixed-term elections. Folks will remember that Doug Ford ignored the fixed-term election law in 2025, and then having won the election, repealed it altogether.
And it's gone now.
It's just gone. But this causes some problems because the administration of elections had been based around this very predictable cadence of elections that we were going to have going forward. And so the chief electoral officer said, okay, fine, if we're not going to do fixed-term elections, here's some things that would make things a bit cleaner, a bit easier.
They want to get rid of the misinformation that often accompanies election campaigns.
Yes, so that is part of it. Some of the misinformation that we have seen in previous election campaigns, things like messages going out telling people to vote in the wrong location or vote on the wrong day. This bill would have made that illegal, would give the chief electoral officer the power to force platforms to take that information down if they find that somebody is falsely broadcasting misinformation. These are pretty common. Well, they are certainly dirty tricks that we have seen in other elections. I can't remember a case in Ontario where we saw something truly consequential, where you looked at a riding and said, oh, well, they only won that riding because of X, Y, or Z dirty trick. But then again, my memory doesn't go back that far.
Somebody got busted for it once upon a time. There was a conservative advisor who did some of these kinds of dirty tricks associated with an election campaign, I want to say 10, 15 years ago or something. Okay. And he did get busted for it. Yeah. But yeah, so I guess what? Dirty tricks are allowed now? Is that what we're saying?
Well, so of course the legislation did not in fact pass. And the government's argument against this bill, I'm going to grossly summarize here, but the argument was presented by MPP Monica Cirillo, who is, we're going to check our Hamilton box here. She's the MPP for Hamilton Mountain.
Here.
And she said more or less that in fact, the 2025 election showed that Ontario's election system is working just fine, that the chief electoral officer does not, in fact, need expanded powers, and that the end of fixed-term elections is not that big a deal and is, in fact, a return to the British parliamentary precedent that existed for more than 100 years.
That's accurate. We have returned to the way it was.
Factual.
Yeah.
Yes.
Okay. Anything else here you want to get up on?
There is a recommendation that the chief electoral officer made that it was not in John Fraser's bill, but it's one I care about, so I'm just going to get on a hobby horse for a moment. The recommendation here is that Ontario schedule its electoral boundary adjustment, redistricting, reapportionment, whatever you want to call it. We have not adjusted Ontario's electoral boundaries since before the 2018 election. It is currently 2026, if everybody's looking at a calendar. The 2026 census just began. We have already passed one census cycle. The current electoral boundaries, I think, are still based on the 2011 census, right? So Ontario's electoral map is out of date and needs updating, and there is no word from the government on what Ontario is going to do next, right? Since 1999, our precedent has been that Southern Ontario has adopted the federal riding boundaries and just mirrored them precisely, and then starting in 2005, we have made adjustments or made allowances for Northern Ontario. We don't remove seats from Northern Ontario despite its relative population shrinking in the province.
In fact, we gave extra seats in Northern Ontario.
Yes, we did.
Recognizing that there are different and special needs in the North that may require accommodation on the floor of the legislature.
Yes, precisely. We don't know at the moment whether that past precedent will continue. The Premier was asked about this once a year or two ago and referred to the federal map as a liberal map. So that, I think, at least calls into the question of whether we are in fact going to mirror the federal ridings again. If we don't want to do that, if we want to draw Ontario's own electoral map, that's a totally reasonable choice to make. That is I have said before, and I will say again, federalism matters, and the province has its own right to make its own electoral map if it wants. But that's a lengthy and involved process to do that properly. So if you're going to do that you kind of the clock is ticking, you kind of want to do that soon. And we have no word yet from the government on whether any of that is going to get started. And I kind of feel like that's an important matter that we should keep in mind.
And for the record, because we do like to clarify the record here, the federal boundaries are not a liberal map, quote unquote, as the Premier said.
Yes, this is important.
This is not, in Canada, we don't gerrymander ridings or districts as they do in the United States to favor those who are in and disfavor those who are out. We have independent judges and academics draw the riding boundaries to make sure that they are as kosher as possible. So
some question about what's going on in Alberta right now.
Fair enough.
In general, we have adhered to this principle of nonpartisan boundaries.
And should continue to.
And yes, and I think we have been extremely well served by that principle. And you are quite right to emphasize that the federal boundary map, here in Toronto, a Liberal MP lost his seat in Don Valley East. Now he found another seat to run in, and is still an MP.
His riding disappeared.
But yeah, his riding disappeared, which is not the kind of thing that is happening in U.S. jurisdictions right now. Let me put it that way.
Well put. And with that, we're off to issue 3. The Ontario government has had enough of open drug use on and around public transit spaces and intends to do something about it. This week, the Solicitor General, Michael Kersner, announced the government will allow special constables, the uniformed peace officers on transit services such as Toronto's TTC, to arrest people for using illegal drugs on the system. Okay, fill us in here.
Right. So the government says that they have an upcoming legislative and regulatory package that will include amendments to the regulation that controls what special constables are allowed to be used for. So you have, certainly if you live in Toronto or you have seen special constables on the TTC, they do not have all of the same powers or, for that matter, training that police officers receive. They are not supposed to be used for all of the same purposes that we use police officers for. And they are, for example, generally not allowed to carry firearms, although some special constables are. It's a very interesting regulation. The limits to what we use special constables for are spelled out in government regulation. And the government is saying that it will add to that regulation that special constables are allowed to enforce the Restriction of Public Consumption of Illegal Substances Act. Now, that name of that legislation might not sound familiar, but it should, because it was mentioned just last year. This was the law the government introduced after the election last year. It allows peace officers to demand someone leave a public area if they are using illegal drugs, and peace officers can also demand that someone identify themselves. It's kind of obvious, but it is already illegal to use and possess illegal drugs, and that's a federal law. This is a provincial law that creates sort of additional offenses and gives these gives provincial peace officers these additional powers. If someone refuses a direction from a police officer or a special constable to leave an area, they can be fined up to $10,000 or imprisoned for up to 6 months.
Do we know when this would take effect?
So I mentioned this is part of a legislative and regulatory package. We're getting kind of late in the calendar for the spring sitting. So if they have legislative measures they are introducing, I kind of don't expect them to get passed before the House rises in early June. But because we are talking specifically about amending a regulation, that is not something where the government needs to, introduce a bill and get 3 readings and 3 votes in the legislature. They can amend the regulation. It's a relatively straightforward matter. They say that the regulation will take effect in July.
Any criticism to this move?
The Canadian Civil Liberties Association, understandably, knowing their background, has condemned the move, saying, in part from a release, I'm going to quote here, Ontario has made a deliberate choice to respond to a public health crisis with coercion instead of care. That comes from Howard Sapers, the executive director of the CCLA, who continued, we need solutions that are effective and rights-respecting, not measures that push vulnerable people further to the margins.
Let's do one more angle on this, because the timing of this is interesting.
Yes.
You being, how do I put this, a sports heathen,
Yes.
may not know that the world is coming to Toronto pretty soon, right? We've got the FIFA World Cup coming here, a bunch of events.
Even I managed to clue into that, yes.
You did know that. Okay, you did know that. Well, that obviously is going to bring a bunch of tourists to Toronto and to BMO Field in Toronto, where the games are happening. But almost all the games are going to be in June before these rules take effect, right?
Yeah, I also noticed that bit. So, if the point is to get drug use out of the public eye, and, yes, the government has made some investments in treatment and other services, but if we're honest, the reason for a law like this is to get drug use out of public spaces. I would have thought that we would want to do it before Toronto hosted its most touristy event of the year. Now, I do want to stress that we might learn more as the government formally introduces this package. There might be ways that this change in regulation does come into effect sooner. But yeah, the timing here, I don't want to be churlish here, but it's just the timing seems odd to me.
Okay, we're staying tuned.
Okay.
And with that, off to your column, my column. Time now for our regular feature. You know it, you love it. We call it Your Column, My Column. I hope they love it. Do you think they love it?
I sure hope so, because
Okay.
we spend a bunch of time on it every week.
I agree. Well, people tell me they like it, so anyway, I just said that. Anyway, JMM and I like to reminisce about the columns that we wrote for the TVO website, tvo.org, over the past week. And what will you favor us with this week?
I decided to reiterate what I think counts as one of my hottest takes in certainly in Toronto politics, which is that Ontario has electoral legislation for municipalities that functionally makes it impossible to have political parties, functioning normal political parties at the municipal level. And I think this is bad, and we should amend the law to allow political parties at the municipal level.
Really?
So
Shame, John Michael McGrath. Shame.
I've been getting a lot of that. I think we like to imagine that, in the absence of political parties, we would have this great Socratic debate, unsullied by the grubby nature of partisan politics. And what we actually have is uncompetitive elections. A kind of morbid fact that is nevertheless true is that in the last 2 election cycles, more city councilors died in office than were defeated by challengers. Incumbency is the most powerful electoral force in Toronto politics. And if you win an election, it almost does not matter how narrowly you win an election. In your first election, you almost have guaranteed employment for life if you want it.
Almost.
There is a sitting city councilor in the current council who won his first election with 17% of the vote and continues to now win handily because basically, in the absence of political parties, people go off of name recognition and hyper-local issues that they care about. Hyper-local issues are important, but it does not make for terribly competitive or responsive politics, I would argue. There are other reasons that I think we should adopt municipal political parties, at the very least for our very large cities, but I raised it specifically this week because, I mean, the municipal election season is getting started, and we are seeing in Toronto two nominally third-party advertising groups, Progress Toronto and A Better City Toronto, or ABC Toronto, that are functionally doing all of the things that political parties do without as much accountability, if I could put it that way. I'm not even saying that they are being like dark money super PACs or anything like that. It's just that like there's no direct electoral connection between these groups and like the candidates they are backing, for example. So yeah, I think we are increasingly lying to ourselves about the nature of these elections, particularly in Toronto. We have functionally things very, very close to political parties, but we're kind of lying to ourselves. And further, I would say that ideas that start in Toronto tend to spread elsewhere. And if we don't see these kinds of groups in other Ontario cities in this election cycle, I suspect we will in the next.
Well, I'll give you this. It almost doesn't matter how far back you go. The mayor and his or her allies usually constitute a bloc or party at City Hall.
Yes.
Then there are the opponents of the mayor, which is another bloc. And then there is this sort of group in the middle that's amorphous and is persuadable one way or the other.
Yes.
So in some respects, we kind of do and have always had three distinct political blocs or parties at City Hall. But you want to take it one step further, don't you?
Yeah, well, let me put it to you this way. In the absence of this specific aspect of Ontario law, like, of course we would have political parties, right? Political parties are what you get as a natural expression of freedom of association and freedom of speech. Political parties have evolved in like every representative democracy, even in cases where they have tried to build representative democracies to specifically suppress political parties, right? We talked about the American founding earlier in the podcast, right? The founding generation of the U.S. Republic was like, we hate political parties and we want to see them never evolve here. And like, within the first U.S. presidential election, there were political parties, right? So I just think if you take local democracy seriously, and I think a lot of our audience does, we've talked about, some of the current government's meddling in local democracy critically. If you take local democracy seriously, then I think you should grapple with the fact that like every other democracy, including like, by the way, lots of peer cities across the globe are run by competitive partisan systems, right? Like New York, London, Paris, Berlin, Rome, like Chicago, like these are all partisan councils. And like even here in Canada, Vancouver and Montreal have party elections, right? So this is one of those times where I just think Toronto needs to get over itself. Toronto, okay. I love you, but like get over yourself.
Okay, you've advanced the case. We should have a couple of guests come on and debate this sometimes, because I'm not sold yet.
Okay.
I'm not sold yet. I'm open-minded on all things, but I'm not sold yet. My column this week is about the Billy Bishop Airport expansion, and I want to ask you just a couple of questions as I unveil what I wrote about. Number one, do you know who's in favor of expanding?
The provincial government and the PC party.
Correct. Do you know who is opposed to the expansion?
The mayor of Toronto and much of City Council.
Do you know what the federal government's position is on this?
I have no idea.
And neither do they. And that's what my column is about. The waterfront is basically run by a tripartite organization that is composed of the city, the province, and the feds. And as you've pointed out, we know what the city and the province think. The feds are being very purposefully quiet on this right now. Why? It's really interesting. The Minister of the Environment, and believe me, a lot of people have made the argument that if you bring bigger jets and longer runways to the airport on the waterfront, a lot of the environmental benefits that you get, namely people using the waterfront, namely people boating there, people doing what they do on the waterfront, going down for a good time, all of that is going to disappear, or much of it would anyway. So the environment minister's riding is right beside Billy Bishop Airport.
Yes.
It's one to the east. She has had nothing to say about this so far, other than we intend to work with all the parties once we see a formal plan from yada, yada, yada. That's about it. I think Julie Zarowitz from the Davenport riding is the only Liberal MP who has had anything to say about this. But otherwise, do you know how many seats? There are 24 seats in the 416, 24 seats of MPs in the city of Toronto. Do you know how many seats the Liberals hold? of the 24.
It's 24?
23.
Oh.
They've got all but one. Roman Baber's the one conservative up in the Northwest.
Yes. Somebody corrected us on that, yes.
Yeah, 23 out of 24. And yet, for some reason, 22 of the 23 have really headed for the hills and are trying to avoid this issue. I don't know if they're trying to curry favor with the Prime Minister, who is being studiously quiet because he's trying to curry favor with the Premier. It's a very interesting situation. The added interesting part about this is there's a guy named Greg Sorbera. Is a name that will mean something to some of our viewers. He was Dalton McGuinty's finance minister earlier in this century. And he, the former Liberal Minister of Finance of Ontario, has written a letter to the federal Liberal Environment Minister explaining all the reasons why he thinks the airport expansion should not happen. He was assured he would get a response from her in 10 days. That was, how long ago was that? That was April 5th. That was more than a month ago. And still, crickets from that minister's office. This thing just gets curiouser and curiouser. And actually, there was a development earlier this week. David Crombie, the former mayor of Toronto, we're going back 50, 55 years, back into the early 1970s, initiated something in which he, David Miller, former mayor, Barbara Hall, former mayor, Arthur Eggleton, former mayor, John Sewell, former mayor, are all on board as saying, we oppose the airport expansion, and we wonder why the feds are being so quiet about not taking a position on it. So that's what my column is about. And speaking of David Crombie, I mentioned in this space, last week, I think, that he had just turned 90 years young. And somebody sent me this picture. Sheldon, can we bring this up? This guy on the left is Paul Bedford. He's a former chief planner for the city of Toronto. And the guy on the right is 90-year-old David Crombie. This is from his 90th birthday party. And the two of them are holding, if you can imagine this, they are holding in their hands an issue of Time magazine from when David Crombie was mayor. And the mayor of Toronto in the 1970s was on the cover of the American version of Time magazine because he was doing so many far-sighted things about the greening of Toronto back in the day. Yeah. People were just astonished at how many big and beautiful parks we had in Toronto for a big city. So happy birthday, David Crombie. Again, congratulations again on getting the cover of Time magazine, which was a pretty cool thing. Yes. And he's still, at age 90, getting his feet wet as it comes to being involved in important public issues.
Yes. An appropriate waterfront metaphor.
There we go. Yes, indeed. Yes, indeed.
All right. Shall we get to the mailbag?
Let's do it. If you've got a burning question or an insightful comment, we always love hearing from you. onpolitics@tvo.org is our email address. What do you got this week, JMM?
We have an email from Lisa Friedman who writes, I was listening to your podcast this morning and I want to give you some information. I started as a committee clerk at the legislature in 1989 and eventually became clerk of committees and a table clerk. I left in 2012. I actually had a premier sit as a committee member on a standing committee. So we referred in last week's episode to Paul Calandra sitting in on a committee considering his own legislation. And we said that is unusual for a cabinet minister. So Lisa did not just have a cabinet minister sitting in on her committee. She had the premier sit in on a committee. It was Mike Harris, she says. I can't remember what the committee hearing was on, but the group appearing was the Ontario Federation of Labour. It sticks out in my memory for a number of reasons, but one of them was because the witness was Carol Ann Skeevier, and she inadvertently referred to the premier as Brother Harris. I'm sure the premier got a kick of that. I can think of one or two other occasions where a minister sat in as committee members. Rare, but it has happened. Interestingly, I can only remember one premier appearing as a witness, and that was Bob Ray. The committee was looking at his conflict of interest policy. Yours, Lisa Friedman.
Isn't that interesting? Okay, great. We put these things on the air in the hopes that people will, people who've got more experience on the ground than we do in some cases will respond, and Lisa did, and that's great. Just Bob Ray's not the only one who's appeared before a committee. I'm pretty sure Mike Harris certainly appeared as a witness before a committee. Dalton McGuinty did. Kathleen Wynne did.
Yes. We mentioned that select committee earlier. Kathleen Wynne was called to testify before that select committee.
Oh, do you know who the first premier to appear before a legislative committee was?
Oh, there you go.
Hello again, George Drew. There was some organized crime happening in Ontario. I know it's impossible to believe. Back in the 1940s, and the premier was called as Premier George Drew was called as a witness to appear before a legislative committee to testify about what he knew about organized crime in Ontario. I think he was the first. It was certainly a rare occasion when it happened, but of course in more later years, I guess I should say, where committee members and committee chairs might want to get on the news more.
Yes.
Surefire way to get on the news is demand that the premier show up and testify.
Yes, and there's that tension between the ambitions of MPPs in the committee versus their loyalty to the premier of the day.
There you go.
Right?
There you go. Okay, give the email address and let's get out of here.
Right. Again, if you'd like to ask about content on the show or just send us some memories of your own time at Queen's Park, please email us at onpolitics@tvo.org.
Perfect. Okay, that is the On Poly podcast for this Friday, May the 8th, 2026.
You can follow our show wherever you get your podcasts so that you get notified each time a new episode is available, and you can see the video version of the podcast on the TVO Today YouTube channel.
Any feedback you have, we're always happy to hear it, good, bad, or indifferent. Write us an email at onpolitics@tvo.org. Please include your first and last name and where you're from.
This week's episode was produced by Tiff Lamb, video editing by Colin Kish.
Production support from Jonathan Hallowell and TVO's Digital Media Services team.
Laurie Few is the executive producer of Digital. Stacey Dunseith is the acting vice president, programming and content.
We always like to thank the crew for making the video portion of the podcast happen. And where's David Chung? I want to give a shout out to David Chung. There he is back there on that camera. David Chung and I, we're having a tough time these days. You may have heard the Leafs didn't make the playoffs this year. And the only Canadian team left in the playoffs, John Michael, are the...
I assume they play hockey.
Just when I think I'm making progress with this, the Montreal Canadiens are the only team left. And I'm sorry, I know you're supposed to cheer for the Canadian teams in the playoffs. David and I agree. It's impossible for Leaf fans to cheer for the Habs in the playoffs. So please meet me at camera 2 as I say, go Buffalo Sabres, and until next Friday, bye-bye.
Bye-bye.